Canada just made a move that could seriously change the lumber fight with Washington. Instead of simply fighting US tariffs, Ottawa is pushing to reshape the entire forest industry, new markets, new products, and more Canadian demand. And if this plan works, the biggest surprise may be what happens to America's lumber supply next. Canada's softwood lumber industry is facing a major test, but Ottawa is no longer treating this as just another tariff fight with Washington. The government is working on a much bigger plan to change how Canada's forest industry works. The goal is simple: make the sector stronger, more modern, and less dependent on one major market. For years, Canadian lumber producers have faced US trade actions, including anti-dumping and countervailing duties. These measures have made it harder for Canadian companies to sell into the American market at normal costs. But Canada's response is now moving beyond simply asking Washington to remove those duties. The Canadian government has created a forest sector transformation plan based on recommendations from a national task force. The task force finished its work in April 2026, after looking at the problems facing the industry. Its recommendations cover everything from access to wood and modern mills, to new products, workers, housing, and international markets. One of the biggest ideas is diversification. Canada wants its forest companies to reach more customers outside the United States. That means finding new markets and selling more valuable products instead of depending so heavily on basic lumber exports. This could give Canadian producers more choices if American trade barriers stay in place. The plan also looks at what Canada does with its own wood. Ottawa wants more Canadian lumber and mass timber to be used inside Canada, especially in construction. Federal programs are being changed to encourage Canadian materials in government projects. The idea is to create stronger demand at home while Canadian companies build new markets abroad. This matters because Canada has an enormous forest industry, but much of its wood has traditionally been tied to the US market. The new strategy is trying to change that balance. Canada's draft action plan says the country needs a stronger forest sector that can compete globally instead of relying on old business models. And Ottawa is putting real money behind the effort. The federal government has made about 1.7 billion Canadian dollars available through loans and loan guarantees for softwood lumber producers. And if you want the real story behind how Canada is still holding its ground through tariffs, wars, and hard times, hit join below to join the membership for exclusive documentaries you won't see anywhere else about Canada's progress and rise through uncertainty. Another $500 million is planned for product and market diversification and programs designed to transform the wider forest sector. There's also help for workers. Canada has committed funding for training and support for forest workers affected by mill shutdowns or reduced operations. The goal is not only to keep companies alive during the trade fight, but to help workers stay employed as the industry changes. Then there's another part that could become very important: transportation. Canada has been working to reduce the cost of moving lumber between provinces. Lower shipping costs could make Canadian wood more competitive in other parts of the country and could help producers reach markets that were previously too expensive to serve. But this is where the story gets interesting for Washington. The United States has used tariffs and trade restrictions to protect its own lumber producers. The argument from the US industry is that Canadian government support gives Canadian producers an unfair advantage. The US Lumber Coalition has strongly criticized Canada's support programs, showing just how closely Washington's lumber industry is watching Ottawa's moves. At the same time, American builders still need wood. That creates a difficult balance. If Canadian producers become more competitive in other markets and reduce their dependence on the United States, Washington could have less influence over where that Canadian lumber goes. And Canada is not only talking about selling more wood. The transformation plan calls for modernizing the industry and creating new forest-based products. That could include more advanced building materials and mass timber products. The bigger goal is to get more value from every part of Canada's forest industry instead of depending mainly on traditional lumber exports. This is why the word strategy matters. Canada is trying to turn a short-term trade crisis into a long-term industrial change. Instead of asking, how do we survive the next US tariff? The bigger question becomes, how do we build a forest industry that can survive even if the US market becomes harder to reach? And Washington has a reason to pay attention. The US and Canada remain deeply connected through trade, and the lumber dispute is happening inside a much wider fight over tariffs and market access. Recent negotiations between Prime Minister Mark Carney and President Donald Trump show that the relationship remains tense, with major trade questions still being negotiated. So Canada's move is bigger than a fight over lumber prices. Ottawa is trying to reshape the supply chain, protect workers, build more at home, develop new products, and find customers around the world. If those changes succeed, Canada may not need to depend on the American market in the same way it did before. But Canada's plan will not be easy. The softwood lumber industry has been under pressure for years, and the latest US duties have added even more stress. The Bank of Canada says Canadian lumber exports were about 20% below their 2024 average by February 2026. Production and jobs have also fallen, showing that this is not just a political fight, it is already affecting real businesses and workers. The US trade case is also far from over. Canada is still dealing with anti-dumping and countervailing duties on its softwood lumber. In the latest administrative review, the US Commerce Department published preliminary and post-preliminary duty rates for Canadian producers. These numbers are not the final rates, but they show that the trade dispute is still creating serious pressure on Canadian companies. That is why Canada is trying to build a different future. The government's Forest Sector Action Plan focuses on changing the industry instead of simply waiting for the next trade settlement. Canada is working with provinces, territories, and Indigenous partners to make the sector more competitive, find new markets, and build products that can bring more money into the country. One important part of this plan is moving toward higher value products. Instead of sending mostly traditional lumber to foreign buyers, Canada wants to grow areas such as engineered wood, mass timber, biofuels, and other forest-based products. These products can create more value from Canada's forests and may open doors in industries far beyond normal home construction. Canada is also trying to create more demand inside the country. Federal procurement rules are being changed to encourage the use of Canadian lumber and mass timber. That matters because a stronger domestic market could give Canadian producers another place to sell when exports become harder. It also fits with Ottawa's larger push to build more homes and infrastructure inside Canada. And this is where the strategy could become a real challenge for Washington. For decades, the United States has been Canada's most important customer for many forest products. If Canadian producers can successfully build new markets, increase domestic demand, and create higher value products, the US market may become less important than it was before. But there is a catch. Moving away from the US market cannot happen overnight. Canadian companies need customers, transportation, financing, and new production systems. Building a new market takes years, while tariffs can hurt a company immediately. That means Ottawa has to protect businesses today while trying to build something much bigger for tomorrow. The Canadian government is already using financial support to help companies make that transition. In July, Ottawa announced a $60 million loan for Arbec Bois d'Oeuvre in Quebec. The stated goal was to help the company keep operating while moving toward a business model that is less dependent on the United States. That is a clear example of what Canada wants the wider industry to do. There is also a major worker issue. When mills slow down or close, entire communities can feel the impact. Canada has set aside money for training and support for affected forest workers, including programs aimed at helping people move into other skilled jobs. The government says more than 6,000 affected forest workers could receive support through these measures. Still, Washington is unlikely to simply ignore Canada's move. US lumber producers have argued that Canadian government support gives Canadian companies an unfair advantage. From their point of view, Ottawa's loans, guarantees, and transformation programs could make Canadian producers stronger competitors. So while Canada sees these measures as protection for jobs and an effort to rebuild the industry,